Thank you so much. You can hear me okay with this mic, and apologize, got a little frog in the throat here this morning. And even though this podium is Scott and Shawn sized, I think I'll just maybe wander a little bit here. Please allow me to begin, as is our way, to atak si hat hatwehiksu ma chinopsik ma tikitsu. We have a way amongst our people that we always acknowledge the nation's lands where we are gathered. This is Mississauga of the New Credit. In my language, I recognize their people, their laws. We have this sentiment that says when you're away from your home territory, somebody else's laws are in place. Walk lightly. Be careful. Remember who you are, where you come from, and uphold the standards of the roots of the lineage where you come from. And that's my responsibility. I do carry the name A-in-chut. Much to the chagrin of both my wife and I wanted Eagle Flies High or something like that. But no, you get like everyone depends on you. It's like Sityak A-in-chut Histakshit Ahozet Nuchanathat Lakish Beat Ma'as. The second thing we always do is situate ourselves. When you're a little kid in my village of a Howsit, the elders will come up to you as a child and they won't ask you your name. It used to frustrate me. Whose are you? Who do you belong to? I say who my parents are and a little bit frustrated. Don't you want to know my name? And then they start telling me about the responsibilities that I had coming from, as I said in my language, the house of Tlakishbeath, the house rich from the oil rendered from the seal and the whale. I come from a long line of whale hunters on the west coast of Vancouver Island, a little tiny village called Ahozit. As far west as you can go. Anyone been there? Next stop, Japan. Tofino, off the west coast, a few of you know. And I understand I've got a northern Niska friend in the house here as well. Alvin? Recognize Niska delegate there. I understand you've had a Y for many decades, right? And then they just recently discovered that you guys had one or something like that. I just acknowledge you. I think that's fantastic. That is so Niska. That's the way they are. That is just the way the Niska roll. Providing tremendous leadership. And I remember the day my dad read the Niska final settlement agreement and he told me about the genius of the Niska people. And we honor your people and your leadership. So that's the second thing that I wanted to do, is situate myself. Come from the house of Tlakishbeath, born into a family where we have a hereditary chief lineage, which is why I carry this name. And growing up in the context of being in a house on the west coast, seeing the kinds of dysfunction in my community, I didn't understand it. I would ask my dad, why is it like this? There would be stretches of time when the adults would be incapacitated through addictions for a week at a time. And us kids we'd take care of each other. We'd take care of some of the incapacitated adults, feed them breakfast, and go to each other's house for coffee. Maybe that's why I'm 5'4". I don't know. That's what I keep telling. We'd turn on the oil burner from the night before and have coffee at each other's house and toasted peanut butter. And then there would be a calm that would settle, and then life would be, as I would often like to reflect, the best of times and the worst of times. The best of times, you're out on the waters with your parents, with your grandparents. You're out in the foreshores helping to pick the weeds and the grasses that grandmother is sitting in her one-room house with a potbelly stove is doing the weaving, the ancient art and responsibility of passing along teachings, telling you the stories in the language. And I used to ask Dad, why is it that it's like this at home here? And he would begin to teach me. My father is Dr. Richard Atleo, or Umik in our language, and he accomplished something that hadn't been done in our village, in our nation, possibly in British Columbia, maybe in Western Canada, and acknowledged at UBC, the very first First Nations man to achieve an academic doctorate degree. And he's 74 years old today. And that wasn't that long ago, because he went back in his mid-50s and he brought us as a family to the city. And it was such a different thing. I couldn't understand why everyone wasn't fighting out on the streets when we lived even in East Van, which is a tough part of town. It was different in the city. We were certainly disconnected, but Dad was on a mission. On a mission because he is the eldest of 17 children that my late grandmother raised. She bore 15 of them, outlived 3 husbands, this tall, tough woman. One of the toughest you'll find. She went to residential school. All 17 of her kids went to residential school. And now this country is beginning to learn and understand the kind of horrific experiences that they went through. And I won't relive all of those, but to explain how it is that we end up in a room like this with you here today is beginning, for my part, to express the deepest gratitude of participating in your conversations over the couple of days here. Because when Scott talks about the apology, that late grandmother of mine who passed away at 87 years old, we were sitting in the House of Commons together. I was holding her hand. We were both trembling a little bit. And when the apology was done, she turned to me and she said, "Grandson, they are just beginning to see us." That was what she said to me. She repeated it, "They're just beginning to see us." 2008, just a few short years ago. She's left us now, but she left such an incredible legacy to raise those 17 children who are all doing well. And like I said, Dad being at the forefront, an intellectual warrior, helping to answer those questions I was asking as a kid, why is it like this? And he would go back to the debates in Spain in the 1500s when the newcomers were coming to the New World, and Las Casas and Sepulveda were instructed to have a debate about whether those people were human or not. And we know the legacy that we've all collectively in this room inherited. Over 100 years of an Indian Act unilaterally imposed. An education system that we now call the residential schools. You see how we sort of have separated it, right? We call them residential schools because of the sexual and physical abuse and because of the settlement agreement and because of the apology in 2008, but it was an education policy to kill the Indian in the child. And stories that my father would tell of children as young as 7 having their tongues pricked if they tried to speak the only language that they knew. This was our education policy up until not that long ago, in fact. And so it makes a lot of sense that we would arrive at a moment like this and that we would be engaging in a discussion with you where, yes, there are so many issues and sometimes it feels so complex, so difficult, the mountain too high to climb, it's too steep. Let's push this off to somewhere else. That we've got organizations like the Y committed to personal growth, holistic, mind, body, and spirit. Committed to supporting the enhancement of relationships and people coming together. And it's for that, but many other reasons, that I'm so grateful to be here with all of you. And I want to acknowledge you for your support in working with the Assembly of First Nations, and more specifically with Mr. Scott Haldane for his direct work on the First Nations panel for education. It means a great deal to me personally. He was reticent in accepting a personal acknowledgement, but it was with great wisdom and strength and fortitude on his own part that on all of your behalf, he worked with us on this panel. No easy feat. Why would we expect 100 plus years of policy to be simply swept aside? That's part of the pattern that we have the opportunity to break today. The idea that there's a silver bullet, one magical answer, a broad sweep of the brush, and we can be on with it. Or just forget about it and move on. It's a lesson having learned myself the hard way in school in grade 11 when I was telling my dad, I can't do this math. It's too difficult, Dad. I don't know if anyone can attest to that. There's probably a few in here. One really vigorous yes over there. So I would go to Dad and I would say, Dad, I can't do this math. It's too hard. You can have what you say, son. But Dad, there must be an easy way. Dad is an expert in math. Physics even, quantum physics. Surely the guy would give me a code that would allow me to do my math. No, he wouldn't. There's no easy way, son. But Dad, I'm not smart enough. It's too complex. I don't get it. You can have what you say, son. So I didn't pass Algebra 11 that first year. And I finally learned what he was talking about. And I believe it applies to this moment, this very moment in history, not this day, not this week, not even the last 3 months of hunger strikes and Idle No More, not the national panel moment, not the 30 years since the Assembly of First Nations first forged a vision for Indian control of Indian education. It's the very reason why this organization exists, was to fight against ongoing unilateral action by the governments. For 30 years, the Assembly of First Nations has had a focus on education, and we maintain it today. So you learn, and I think it's something that we can learn together. We can co-create a better future through exercises the likes of which we've come through, and we're still right in the middle of. But choosing, as my father instructed me, the easy way was only going to make it more difficult for me, and I found that out. But luckily in grade 11, grade 12, I learned the lesson, did grade 11 over again, had a beautiful girlfriend who is way smarter than me in math and is now my wife of 27 years. She's sitting right here, Nancy. I learned to ask for help, and the idea that there's only one way through this work of transforming the lives of our people, especially our young people, and that's to choose the hard route. Right now, as we sit here today in downtown Toronto, and I won't even talk about the news that's swirling around us about issues of accountability, of corruption. I just did. Sorry. I didn't mean to. But maybe I did only because that is what's happening to our leaders all the time. And yet we're 4% of the national population, and there are children like Jaden right now, 10 years old, northern Manitoba, living in a 20 by 30 foot one-room home with slop pails out on the front porch, no running water, no electricity. And we visited with them not that long ago, Jeffrey and I. I want you to meet Jeffrey Copenis from Treaty 3, Northern Ontario, a young man in his own right, former. When I first formally met Jeffrey, it was when he was working directly with Prime Minister Paul Martin, and he was not but 26 or so years old. Talk about youth stepping into incredible opportunities and challenges. And Jeffrey and I were in northern Manitoba within the last couple of years, and we visited with young Jaden. And I share this story because I know that you as leaders in this room in your respective regions and territories, I know you know the look in a young person's, a young man, a young woman, young boy, young girl's eyes when you see the spirit there. And anything that you would give to support and envelop that person for that potential to be realized in life, no different than young Jaden. So we were talking because I know what that life feels like, and so we talked about the peanut butter up on his shelf. My favorite too when I was a kid. We've got to go after Kraft. We should go after Kraft. They're all over northern communities and reserves. Kraft, let's go after those guys. And his little brother was over on the bed, a toddler, 9 people sharing that room. And then we talked about education, because we're doing this work, and it directly implicates Jaden. First thing he said to me, Scott, was he said, my grandpa is proud of how well I'm doing in school. Incredible resilience that we get to see. Some of the deepest despair, and the reports are this high. The most recent, Amnesty International, December 2012, saying we have a grave human rights crisis right now in this country with First Nations. And what we have on our hearts so often are little guys like Jaden. And it's like looking in the mirror not that long ago, because the line between me being here with you or being behind bars because the incarceration rates are outpacing graduation rates or being underground, it's not a big line. I've been fortunate to have people like my late grandmother in my life and a wonderful partner to walk through this life together. But I don't want to neither overstate nor understate the significance of the challenge because there are successes that are occurring. Make no mistake about it. We visited some of those recently. Cross Lake, Manitoba. Up in, where were we last week? Smithers, after I had my car accident. Hit by a stolen car. That's a story for another day. I was in a cab. Smithers, outside of Smithers, we were in Morristown. We're up in Morristown. They've got I-Count school up there. So we went up to Morristown, and the kids made a video for us, and they showed us in these two schools what meant so much to them about school. How many grade 10 kids do you know that are in large groups saying, all I think about is school? It was so wonderful and inspiring. And so we held this contest and we went up there. And there was a theme between the two schools, and there were many others that submitted videos. It was links to the language, that which residential schools spent generations trying to take away. It was the kids in grade 3 and 4 going, ew, when the rabbit was being skinned by the elder. It was the moose being skinned and chopped up, carved up by the kids up in Morristown, because that's the culture. People being anchored. I've had the great privilege of witnessing it in nations like Niska, who've moved into and away from the Indian Act and into their own governance, taking great courage. We can find examples like this from coast to coast to coast. But on the other hand, I don't want to leave you with the impression that we're where we need to be. We need 65,000 post-secondary graduates just to be on par with the level of success the mainstream population is enjoying right now. And the economic imperative is tremendous. 400 billion would be added to the GDP of this country if we close the education success gap. The mainstream population is aging and retiring at a rapid pace. There's concern about who's going to pay for the health care of those that are retiring. There's concerns about who will fill the jobs. And to give you a sense of the increasing level of acknowledgement about the implications of First Nations in this country, in 2005, Natural Resource Canada estimated that there was about $5 billion in natural resource projects where First Nations were directly implicated. Because of the rising awareness, because of the over 40 court cases that First Nations have won proving rights and title, because of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People being passed by countries around the world, now finally adopted by Canada, admittedly in a tepid fashion, recognizing First Nations' right to free, prior, and informed consent, that 2005 number of a few billion is now over 600 billion. First Nations are having a say right now, but will increasingly have a say. And this is where the grade 11 algebra lesson comes in and the National Panel on Education lesson comes in. There is no easy way forward. This is going to be difficult and challenging, and it is absolutely a challenge that is very uncomfortable for the country. It's a self-reflective moment. It says our legislation and policies are not working. It says the status quo isn't working. It's uncomfortable. You probably, a few of you, because Scott's probably not the only one that watches the media. Maybe you are. This winter was particularly challenging to the point where I didn't even shave for like a week, and Nance got all upset with me. Lost 20 pounds. Those are sub-stories to the real story that's happening here. And I'm asking you to join us all in the uncomfortableness of a status quo that has Jaden where he is right now. I'm also asking that we gravitate to those stories of success, the I-Count School in Morristown, the leadership that the Niska have been providing for a long time, the school in Cross Lake, Manitoba, and what about the over 80% success rate of the Mi'kmaq in Atlantic Canada? These are stories that Scott had the opportunity to witness and observe firsthand, but also the very real reality that we do not have school systems in our communities, not real systems the way we would understand them. And where they do exist, they may not necessarily be anchored in the language and the culture, because you recall residential schools were about removing young people from language, removing young people from the teachings of the elders, from the land, from the treaties. If education was a tool of oppression and suppression and removal and division, should it now not be used as a tool to reconnect, to free, to empower, to support, and to build bridges between First Nations and the rest of Canada. This is the moment where we can accomplish this. I know the power that a group like this, in a room like this, gathered at a moment like this, has the potential to express. I am the beneficiary of, by extension, we now have agreements between the Assembly of First Nations and the YMCA that are formal. There is a multitude of examples across the country that have now been developing. Agreements in Regina, in Calgary, here in Toronto, First Nations, Métis, and perhaps Inuit, Indigenous peoples participating with you, which is the kind of partnership we want to commend, to express appreciation for, and encourage its growth. When I was a teenager, when Dad, like I said earlier, moved us to the city so he could go to school and grab those tools to facilitate the kind of change that were required, it wouldn't have been very hard to end up on the mean streets in East Van, but what was there for me? A Boys and Girls Club and a Friendship Center. And I honed my breakdancing skills in the Boys Club. And then I was an entrepreneur by teaching breakdancing at the Friendship Center to other young Indigenous peoples. And it kept me out of trouble. It kept me off the streets, engaged in something healthy, exercise, something I was proud of, because we need to master things. Everyone in this room, we all deserve the right to be supported to achieve mastery in something. And I really commend the service providers. And my wife Nancy and I ended up having a family organization developed for post-secondary training. And we've forged partnerships with those urban Aboriginal organizations. It's been very pioneering for our people, though. It's only been really since in the 80s and 90s, really drafting off of visionary nations like the Niska, who were doing it far before, looking for solutions for young people, looking for ways to keep young people engaged. So I stand here as a person who, by extension, get an opportunity to thank you in person for the work that you're doing. It's making a difference. It may mean the difference between life and death for a young person, or between life behind bars, or taking choices where we're looking for the easy way out, but it becomes much more difficult and much more traumatic. And that's the moment that I feel we are in this country right now. The panel report has been tabled, the reflections have been offered. And as was said earlier, my role is not that of the Prime Minister of Indians of this country. My role is an advocate. I support an incredibly diverse, over 50 languages, over 600 First Nations, and people say, but you guys are so different. You guys are diverse, maybe even divided and fractured. Well, take a look at mainstream politics. I think there's diversity out there. There's differences out there. People are different. We might share a history, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily all see things the same way as far as how to accomplish the change. And that's the reflections that Scott can probably offer just as well when it comes to the issue of transforming K-12 education, where our kids are underfunded and don't have resources for computers and technology, and don't have resources for things like teacher training or languages right now. And those languages, they're threatened absolutely. Can we consider those a rich part of the cultural heritage of this Canada and say we will support the retention of those languages, because by extension, as was said right here in Ontario, we are all treaty people, which means we're in this together. That's what I see your organization being representative of. And it's about relationships. As Black Elk says, the main purpose of us as people is relationality, to create, maintain, and uphold relationships. So as a way to conclude, I want to bring back to this concept of this being a moment. October 7th, 2013, this year, will mark the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation. 250 years ago, this year, there was a sense of mutual formal recognition between peoples. We still have struggles with that formal recognition, which I would encourage you to consider exploring, understanding the complexities of it, because where Jeff comes from, Treaty Number 3, his ancestors negotiated with the ancestors of those who came to this country the right to education. You provide to me the opportunity to teach your son and daughter, and we'll do the same, so that we might understand each other better. It's a beautiful vision. That was an agreement that our ancestors made. An agreement is an agreement is an agreement. That's something we agreed to. The path has been like this, though. We have a chance now, because the National Panel is offering us the opportunity to not come into something that's easily concluded. It will be very difficult. And it might look a little messy. And there can be no top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. It must be done based on respect and recognition of that deep diversity. You go to the Treaty 3 people so that they can articulate the vision for education in their area based on what the ancestors said in their treaty. That is, by and large, the agreement that we came out of the meeting January 11th. I was sitting there with the Prime Minister and with leaders from across the country, and he expressed and looked us in the eye and said he'd be prepared to work directly with the treaty leadership in areas like Treaty 3 to see a resolution to education in their area. They're not going to all be able to do it on their own. The panel makes a significant contribution. It steps into that difficult space that says we're not okay with the status quo. It is going to be hard going into this. It's going to be difficult, but there is no easy way around it. Choosing the easy way is going to make this harder, and we're going to punt it down to future generations because Jaden is waiting for the adults to get their stuff together right now. All of us. There's pattern challenges. First Nations have them as well. 2 to 4 year electoral terms. You look at that against an electoral system federally and provincially, well, look at it right now. How difficult is it? I hear people in education saying, the politics aren't with us right now. The politics have not been there for First Nations for a long time. We can't wait for the politics. We are the politics. It's us in this room. We can find a way to step into that space and say, the time for transformative change, bold leap forward, not incremental, not choose 1, 2, or 3 things, and maybe down the road we'll be able to see the kind of change that's required. This is coming like a freight train. We've been calling this the Aboriginal tsunami for a long time, and it has arrived. That first wave has arrived, and there's more to come. There's more to come if we don't keep occupying the space. So your work to continue to reach out to the communities, direct engagement of especially Indigenous young people who are looking around the world and wondering, do they see themselves reflected back in a constructive and positive way? Are the opportunities there? Each and every one of you has an opportunity to play a role, and I'm inviting you to join me in the uncomfortableness of the status quo and to say we can make changes right now. Every single person in this room has an opportunity to work with us to break the status quo for young Jaden in that Northern Reserve in Winnipeg, but also for the kids that are in the streets in Toronto. It is an incredible challenge, but it's also one of the biggest opportunities that's in front of us right now. And I feel strongly, very strongly, that in recent months particularly, I've seen Canadians engaging in a manner that I've not seen in over 20 years. And it's encouraging. It's encouraging. It tells us that people care. People want to understand more. And we, on the other hand, we also need to learn how to better reach out. Because it's that old adage, that old notion, and I heard it said by a friend, Ernie Cray, whose close relative was found on the Picton farm, one of those who was murdered in downtown East Side. You know, he was coming from a place of deep trauma, and he says he was challenging that old adage that it sort of reflects that deep mistrust that we've all inherited in this country. I will believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I see it. It's sort of like this. And that's what the panel work is helping us to confront. That perhaps now is the moment when we say to ourselves that we will see it when we believe it. Do we believe this is the moment? Is this the moment when we accept all that's happened in the past and say, this is the moment of change. We're the generation that we've been waiting for. And the young people, they're out there. They're out there. They're leading the way. They're walking 1,600 kilometers from the shores of James Bay to Ottawa. 4,000 of us walking down to Parliament Hill. The granddaughter of Bob Marley, the great legend, reggae legend. She says, we must be in solidarity. We must be in solidarity. There's something happening at this moment. And it's a moment that is described not just by this day when you're gathering, but this is an important part of it. One that I must express deep appreciation for. That you're turning your hearts and your minds to this conversation. I thank you for offering up Scott. Please join me in acknowledging his leadership in the work on the National Panel on Education for this country. I had, I think, a really good speech prepared that I'm not going to read. But that's what was on my heart and mind when I arrived here today. That we have philanthropic organizations like yours, and my wife said one day, we need to get Mike Holmes to help out. I won't say anything more about what she said to me about Mike Holmes. We have Habitat for Humanity, building homes with First Nations here in Canada's own backyard. We've got Right to Play, working with kids to say they have the right to play. We have Wes Prankert, a young man from Southern Ontario, pledging to build playgrounds for kids on reserve in Northern Ontario. We have Free the Children, Mark and Craig Kilberger, who build schools in places like Kenya and around the world, turning their attention to Aboriginal education here in Canada. We have people like former Prime Minister Paul Martin doing work on the Aboriginal Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, these are just small examples of what fill me with hope. That yes, the challenge seems incredibly great, overly complex, too difficult to comprehend. But I have great belief in the genius of people, particularly when we come together and start peeling back the layers. And if we choose to, we can, in this moment, change the future, change the present, and invest in youngsters like Jaden. Thank you very much for having me here at your annual General Assembly.